Hi, I'm Rob Schnepp. This is an online virtual version of the smoke symposiums that we do around the United States. And the intent is really to give you, the viewer, a little bit of information about the dangers of fire smoke, some treatment options, making sure that you wear your personal protective equipment. So let's spend a few minutes talking about some of the dangers of fire smoke. The coalition has looked at the problem of fire smoke in a couple of different ways, and it's somewhat sequential. And that sequence breaks down to awareness, prevention, protection, detection, diagnosis, and treatment. My job here today is to talk to you a little bit about the awareness and education piece of this. And that really revolves around the dangers of fire smoke. And I know people in this audience who've been in the fire service for a while have breathed smoke. It's just sometimes an unavoidable piece of the business. What I would like to make clear, though, is that there are some deadly toxins in fire smoke that you may not be aware of. And I'd like to help illustrate some of the reasons why you should be so compelled to wear your personal protective equipment, especially your SCBA. So let's talk about some of the fine focus here. And really, when we ask the question to people about what they believe is dangerous or hazardous in fire smoke, typically the answer comes back that carbon monoxide is the #1 toxicant in fire smoke. I'm here to tell you, however, that hydrogen cyanide is another large component of fire smoke that you should be concerned with. So we call them the toxic twins. When both of these toxicants are inhaled through fire smoke, the synergistic effect of both of them can be deadly, and they can incapacitate civilians or firefighters. We'll talk more about the mechanism of action of both of these toxicants and how they affect you once you've been exposed. Additionally, acute and chronic exposure to cyanide in fire smoke is definitely plaguing firefighters with line-of-duty deaths. There's been many cases across the country where firefighters have worked a shift, gone home, and had heart attacks. Or they've worked shifts and had to leave early or go home because they weren't feeling well after a fire. And I would bet anyone in this audience who's been a firefighter for a while has had the banging headache after the fire, or what I like to affectionately call the fire boogers in the nose, which is all that sooty, nasty sort of residual smoke that you've breathed in when you weren't wearing your SCBA, particularly during overhaul. So here's our perception. Our perception is smoke is part of the job, and a lot of times we refer to that as just smoke. And here's what I'd like for you to do today. Stop using the word just in front of smoke at any point in time, because in my opinion it minimizes really what we should expect as dangers to fire smoke. So let's agree that we'll just look at it and we'll call it smoke, not just smoke. If we do that, I think our perception begins to change. And the important thing to remember here is that smoke is typically viewed as and referred to as a tactical marker on fire scenes. We refer to smoke as smoke showing from the back of the building, or we've got heavy smoke on a particular fire floor, or smoke in some other way indicates some place we should take action as firefighters. But I'd like for you to look at smoke in a completely different way. I'd like for you to look at it sort of clinically and understand that it's a collection of gases and particulates that are an expression of what's burning. And it's really a simple chemical process. Whatever's burning will be expressed in the smoke. So in chemistry, we call that garbage in, garbage out. Fire is a chemical reaction. It's a rapid oxidation of a fuel that evolves heat and light. That chemical reaction also contains toxic gases such as hydrogen cyanide, carbon monoxide, formaldehyde, sulfur compounds, hydrogen chloride, oxygen, water vapor, all different sorts of things. And so if you look at the smoke and you really try to understand it from a toxicity standpoint, it should become readily apparent that your perception of that smoke should change. Most firefighters would agree and probably learned in their own fire academy that carbon monoxide was the main killer in smoke, and that was pretty much it. So if a civilian or even a firefighter dies as a result of a smoke exposure, we generally categorize it or look at it, or have in the past anyway, as a smoke exposure in which carbon monoxide was the primary toxicant. Well, I'm here to tell you that hydrogen cyanide plays as important of a role in carbon monoxide when it comes to toxicity in fire smoke. So this is something that you should understand. When you take a look at some of the other sections of this virtual smoke symposium, other instructors will will illustrate that hydrogen cyanide has been identified and detected in training fires and on real fire scenes as well. And the interesting thing is that most of these fires that you take a look at aren't the big, huge chemical plant fires or big warehouse fires. They're in many cases very small. And I think that's sort of a misunderstanding, is that we equate bad levels of smoke with big fires that would appear to be very dramatic. And in many, many cases, it's really quite the opposite. There's been quite a number of instances where a pot on the stove or a small kitchen fire or smoke 1 or 2 rooms or apartments away have shown to have high levels of hydrogen cyanide and carbon monoxide. So just keep that in mind, that our perception of smoke should change. There are some myths that we need to debunk whenever we learn about smoke and we look at smoke. And we also have to kind of take a look at our just general misunderstandings. And so I can tell you today, smoke's bad for you. You shouldn't breathe it. And it can kill you if you take the wrong kind of action. I'd like to draw your attention to the photograph that you see on the slide that's directly adjacent to the blue text that says the toxic twins. Look closely at that picture. You'll notice that the firefighter that's working on that fire is completely enveloped in their environment. That firefighter is very similar to a scuba diver who is completely enveloped in their environment. And when you think of yourself and your air supply, think of yourself as a smoke diver. You're completely enveloped in your environment. If something goes wrong, you have no other place to go. There's really no safe haven. And so when you go out to work and you work on a fire, make sure that you understand that you're completely enveloped in your environment. You've got very little margin for error. If you're 10 minutes away from getting out of a building with only 6 minutes of air supply, you know you've got a problem. Scuba divers typically take their reserve air supply and they treat that as gospel. They will not bargain that away. I'd suggest to you today that a misunderstanding that should be identified is that that air supply is golden. It should be treated with respect and you should keep track of it at all times. So what is smoke? Well, a technical definition of smoke is an aerosol of solid or liquid particles, usually resulting from incomplete combustion. Now that's a technical definition, and when you look at some of the language and regulations like OSHA and NIOSH and some of those others, aerosol has a specific meaning, just as dust and fume and mist and those sorts of things do. In our realm, when we talk about smoke, you need to think about it this way. There's particulates that you see, and those result from incomplete combustion. And then there's the gaseous part. And those gases are in the smoke. They are part of this aerosol. They make up smoke. And smoke is very complicated. It is, combustion chemistry is something that is not that straightforward. It's very dependent on ventilation. It's very dependent on the materials burning. It's very dependent on how hot the fire is burning and the fuels that cause that fire to burn. But when you think about smoke, again, as I mentioned before, think about it clinically. We have this aerosol. We have all these particles flying around in the convected heat column that's coming off of the fire. And mixed within that are gases, again, like hydrogen cyanide, carbon monoxide, and the aldehydes and some others. Take a look at the photo on the right, and you'll notice that there's a single gas hydrogen cyanide meter, and the 25 is registering 25 parts per million of cyanide. That's a dumpster fire outside an apartment complex, which is something that you all have gone to many times in your career. And the meter reading is taken about 30 feet away. So at 30 feet away from a dumpster fire, there was 25 parts per million of hydrogen cyanide. Inside that dumpster was nothing more than household trash items. There was nothing that was significantly unusual. There was nothing that would really indicate that something bad was burning in there. It was just a dumpster fire, and something, again, I venture to guess you've gone to many times in your career. So these are live readings, and you'll see through this program and through other sections that firefighters just like you have taken readings at fires just like this and gotten these very same sorts of indications. So again, I can say with confidence that hydrogen cyanide is present at the fire scene. The only question is how much. Could be a couple parts per million, could be 60 parts per million. That part is unknown without detection and monitoring on the scene. But I think you can take pretty much as a fact that hydrogen cyanide will be present whenever you go to work on a fire, as will carbon monoxide. The anatomy of fire smoke, again, as I mentioned, is very complicated, but here are some examples of what you would find in the smoke. First of all, you'll notice mentioned there are particulates, such as dust and soot. Soot's a very interesting component of fire smoke because it's a known human carcinogen. And it's one of those things that's present on every fire. You know that when you come back from a fire and the cab of the fire engine is full of soot, or there's soot all over the SCBA harness, or it's on the clipboard, or it's on your bunker gear, that gets airborne and you breathe that. And I can tell you that breathing a known human carcinogen is not something that you would probably do if you understood that hazard. So think about that soot present on every fire to some degree gets airborne, and it could get in your lungs. And then that's something that definitely causes or could cause long-term health effects. Other irritants include hydrochloric acid, sulfur dioxide, the oxides of nitrogen, and ammonia. And out of that list, a couple that are really prevalent are the oxides of nitrogen, and there are several. But the hazard with those is that in high temperature combustion, which most structure fires are, those nitrogen-based compounds can cause pulmonary edema or fluid in the lungs. Have you ever noticed that when you went to a fire and maybe you breathed a lot of smoke, a couple days later or even later that day you find yourself coughing and there's some lung irritation? In some cases that could be attributed to those oxides of nitrogen. Some of the asphyxiants or toxicants that are identified are carbon dioxide, hydrogen cyanide, carbon monoxide, and hydrogen sulfide. And again, the toxic twins that you see there, hydrogen cyanide and carbon monoxide, are generally responsible for most of the illness and death that occurs secondary to smoke inhalation. Here are some examples of chemicals and chemical compounds that might be liberated when common household items are burned. You'll see at the top there is polyethylene, and polyethylene is a common plastic that you can find in many things that are made for the household. You'll notice that there are particles, and CO is given off of that. That shouldn't be such a big surprise that carbon monoxide is given off by burning plastics. Polystyrene, poly in the chemical world means many. Styrene is a chemical compound that is a cousin to the benzene ring, and we know benzene is a known human carcinogen. And when that burns, that liberates tremendous amounts of carbon monoxide. PVC is also on the list. It means polyvinyl chloride. And when that particular plastic is burned, it gives off hydrogen chloride gas and also phosgene. Phosgene you might be familiar with when you've taken WMD training or you've been talking about weapons of mass destruction or terrorist events, because it's one of those that's suspected or we worry about being a terrorist weapon. Phosgene is made up of carbon monoxide bonded to chlorine. Neither one of those are good. So when that gas is liberated, it's clearly toxic for you if you breathe that. And so when PVC burns or similar substances to PVC, phosgene will be liberated. Wood and cellulose also liberate toxic substances. You'll see on the slide there, carbon monoxide is one of them, and also aldehydes. And again, I mentioned earlier that the aldehyde compounds could be linked to thyroid cancer as they become impregnated in the Nomex hood and pulled tight to the throat during active firefighting with the collar of your jacket. On the bottom there is ABS pipe, and that's acrylonitrile butadiene styrene. And there are cyanide compounds in those plastics already. So when they break down because of thermal decomposition, you'll definitely get a lot of nasty stuff coming off those. So how do we know that there's cyanide in fire smoke? Well, as you see in the picture there, again, we're revisiting that dumpster fire that we can, through detection and monitoring, identify the presence of cyanide in fire smoke. And I think what you should accept is that it's just there. Again, the only variable will be how much cyanide is present, and is it present where you're working? More than likely the answer to that is yes. One of the big pieces that we need to talk about, though, is the presence of hydrogen cyanide during overhaul. Fire gets knocked down. Typically the first in crews that begin working will take their masks off and they perform all the overhaul without wearing an SCBA mask. This is pretty common, pretty typical around the country. That's about the worst time to be walking around in the smoke, because during the smoldering phase, incomplete combustion does not allow these chemical substances to break down. They're liberated in the smoke. You're breathing fast because you've been working hard, and you're not wearing a mask, and all the soot and all the materials like fiberglass insulation and all the chemical substances that are given off, you're wandering around in the smoke and you're breathing it at, again, perhaps the worst time there. That begs the question, how long do you wear an SCBA? I don't really have an answer for you. It's fire by fire, instance by instance, and your own agency will have to develop standard operating procedures or standard operating guidelines to determine when you can take your mask off. What I'd like to say here today, though, is that as you think back to all these toxic substances in the smoke and how they're liberated during the overhaul phase of a fire, it might lead you to come up with some solutions about how long to wear a self-contained breathing apparatus, at what point can you stop ventilating the structure, those types of things. I will suggest to you, though, that wearing a bandana across your face during overhaul does not filter out the gases. Neither does a surgical mask. You really have to take your air with you to be completely safe. So the question has to be in your mind, how bad can it be? And it means hydrogen cyanide and carbon monoxide. Well, here's some values for you to consider. The IDLH, which means immediately dangerous to life and health value, for CO, carbon monoxide, is 1,200 parts per million. That same value, IDLH for hydrogen cyanide, is 50 parts per million. The REL, or recommended exposure limit for carbon monoxide, is 35 parts per million. And the recommended exposure limit for hydrogen cyanide is 5 parts per million. You'll also see that HCN levels, hydrogen cyanide levels, above 270 parts per million can be fatal in 6 to 8 minutes. So let's set the stage here. These values are fairly low. When you think about a part per million, think of it this way. The REL for hydrogen cyanide is 5 parts per million. So to give you a visual image about that, that would be 5 red golf balls in a million. Imagine the room you're in right now filled with 1 million golf balls and pick out 5 of those. That's a very small amount. And this underscores a toxicological principle, and a way to look at toxicity is that I don't want to know how much I can stand from a toxicity standpoint. I want to know how little will kill me. And when you look at these two values, you're seeing them at fairly low levels, 5 parts per million as a recommended exposure limit for cyanide. That's not very much. So when you go to work on a fire, and think back a couple of slides to the dumpster fire, 25 parts per million at a dumpster fire. Our regulatory body, OSHA, tells us here that 5 parts per million is really what should be the most on a daily basis that you're exposed to. So 25 parts per million is quite a bit higher. Imagine you're working on a structure fire and the fire gets knocked down, and immediately after you take your mask off, it's pretty likely that you're going to see at least 5 to 10 and even more parts per million of cyanide there. So again, think about toxicity this way. It's not how much I can take, it's how little will kill me or hurt me. I'd like to give you a couple of examples here now to underscore what I've been talking about in terms of hydrogen cyanide present at your fires. Take a look at this. You'll notice that it's just a typical pot on the stove sort of a call that you run on a very frequent basis. You'll notice that the fire damage to the cabinets above the pot, very minimal. The fire was put out before the fire department arrived, and that's not uncommon to be updated en route, and your control center or dispatch will tell you that the fire's out. You arrive, there's light smoke coming out the front door of the house. This particular instance, the moderate amount of smoke was ventilated, and the first division readings for hydrogen cyanide were 7 parts per million, and the second division reading were 22 parts per million. Hydrogen cyanide is a lighter than air gas, so it would make sense that the areas above the fire could potentially have a higher concentration of cyanide than the lower levels. So imagine what the levels were while the elderly occupant was waiting to be rescued. I agree with Captain Cruisen here. When we show up at a fire, typically we've missed the incipient and the growing stage of the fire in which the people might be exposed. So a small fire starts. In this case, an elderly occupant was trying to extinguish the fire and to be rescued. And imagine what the levels of hydrogen cyanide were from the beginning of the fire to the point the fire department arrived. Could be very high. Here's another example, one that I've already shared with you. The dumpster fire at 25 parts per million. The meter was not directly in the path of the smoke either. So again, put yourself on the back side of that meter and you're the one taking the reading. Not directly in the smoke, and still we were reading 25 parts per million. So Really, when you think about it, you don't have to be in the smoke to be exposed. You walk into a room, perhaps it's adjacent to the room where the fire was burning, or maybe it's the apartment next door. There's a light haze in the room, and you take a reading and it's highs, 25 parts per million. Well, again, you can't equate the volume of the smoke with the volume of the toxicants inside. Sometimes there's light smoke, high readings. Sometimes there's heavy smoke, might be low readings. Sometimes you might see a lot of carbon monoxide. Sometimes you might see a lot of cyanide. And really the only constant is there is no constant, because each fire is different. This fire that you see on the screen in front of you, that happens in a rainstorm, or it happens with different components or different elements inside that dumpster. It's a completely different fire. So let's take smoke and let's put it in the centerpiece of our job, not on the side, and look at all the things that smoke affects. You'll see the active firefighting there. Smoke definitely is present during active firefighting and overhaul, which you can see, which prompts us to begin to think about our level of protection, wearing self-contained breathing apparatus, doing metering and monitoring at the scene, all those correlations that we think about between smoke and our operations. Are victims trapped? Have they been exposed? Do we have to render medical treatment? That smoke really drives a lot of what we do in those particular situations. You'll also see that mop-up is listed there. Mop-up in a wildland firefighting situation is a place where we need to be concerned. Maybe those of you watching today don't do much wildland work. Maybe you do. But I can tell you that fires outside buildings or in wildland areas also generate levels of toxic materials. Some cyanide, some carbon monoxide. So there's a link there. The WUI stands for the Wildland Urban Interface. And this is where wildland firefighters really need to pay attention. Imagine that you're working on the flank of a fire. There's 50 homes being protected. 10 of those homes are burning, and you're on a structure protection crew. So not only are you breathing the contents of what's burning inside the house, you're also breathing the house itself as it's decomposing. So it's a complete structure fire. You're breathing all the components of everything that was used to build that fire. Typically, wildland firefighters do not wear SCBA. So they are at quite a bit of risk from breathing smoke, especially in this wildland urban interface. You'll notice there's a link to the image of the heart there. Again, there's some suggestions that long-term exposures to cyanide and carbon monoxide could cause cardiac problems down the road, could cause central nervous system disturbance down the road, could cause all kinds of long-term health effects, including cancer. And this is a big one. The reason why this is important is that in many states, cancer is considered presumptive in the fire service. But think about this. Let's turn the clock forward 10 or 15 years. Perhaps presumptive cancer laws get challenged when people can prove that we weren't wearing our personal protective equipment that we were provided. Just something to think about. Also, things you should consider are links between the physical irritation that smoke has on your lungs over a long period of time. Components of fire smoke like formaldehyde and the oxides of nitrogen are physical irritations to the lungs. Can cause you to cough, can cause just basic repetitive irritations to the lungs, which could lead to some sort of dysfunction down the road. So all in all, and to summarize this slide, take smoke, take it out of the background, put it in the forefront, and in your own mind, think about all the links that smoke has to your job. And there are quite a few. Now let's talk a little bit about the medical end of this. We've started our conversation talking about some of the general hazards of fire smoke. We've included some guidance and some suggestions about how to protect yourself on a long-term basis. Talked a little bit about some of the acute and chronic health effects. But now let's start thinking about this. You have a civilian who's pulled from a working structure fire, has been trapped for several minutes, is now in the front yard and requiring medical treatment. That's a common scenario. Or a firefighter has been separated from the crew, suffers an out-of-air emergency, is rescued by a rapid intervention team, and brought outside the structure. A couple of different scenarios that have played out in our business and play out across the country every day. Once all the other things have failed, once the prevention measures have failed, Once we're at the point where we need to render medical care to people who've been exposed to smoke, we have to have a discussion about antidotes and what antidotes do and why they're so important. A red blood cell is much like a city bus. Oxygen gets on the bus, it drives to its destination, which is cells in the body. Oxygen gets off, it's used within the cells for aerobic metabolism, which is good. You get exposed to carbon monoxide, and carbon monoxide actually gets on the bus easier than oxygen. The red blood cell prefers carbon monoxide to oxygen by about 200 times. Why that's important is, as your red blood cell, again the bus, stops to pick up oxygen, it only picks up a portion of what it should really have. The rest of the seats on the bus are taken up by carbon monoxide. So point one is that people who've been exposed to smoke, either a little or a lot, have a compromised oxygen transport system. Somebody who's unconscious, unresponsive, down on the ground, maybe they're flatline heart rhythm, they're in asystole, certainly has a high level of circulating carbon monoxide, which have taken up the ability or decreased the ability of the red blood cell to transport oxygen. So that's one side of the house. Second side of the house, when hydrogen cyanide is involved, it's a completely different mechanism of action. Hydrogen cyanide blocks the oxygen from being used inside the cell. So imagine this. Imagine a door, and on one side of the door is the inside of the cell where aerobic metabolism takes place. On the other side of the door is where oxygen would enter the cell, and that door is locked with a heavy chain and a heavy lock. That's cyanide. Cyanide blocks a receptor called the cytochrome oxidase and prohibits oxygen from entering the cell. We have two problems. The oxygen transport system has been compromised by carbon monoxide, and the ability of oxygen to get into the cells and participate in aerobic metabolism has now been stopped. And so your body has an oxygen problem. And really, in its simplest form, both of these toxicants do not allow oxygen to do its job. That's really as simple as I can make it. Carbon monoxide, quote unquote, kills the blood. Hydrogen cyanide, quote unquote, kills the cells. It just is a double whammy that does not allow oxygen to do its job. So from a medical standpoint, what's that mean to us? Well, that means that as healthcare providers, paramedics, EMTs, physicians in the hospital, we need to figure out a way to unlock that door and let oxygen get into the cell and do its job. And we do that by using antidotes. In the U.S. today, there are 2 cyanide antidotes available in the United States. The first one, as you see on the slide, is called the Cyanide Antidote Kit, or the CAK. Other names that you might see it called by are the Taylor Kit, Lilly Kit, and the Pasadena Kit. No matter what the name, they all have the same components. The active ingredients of this particular kit are amyl nitrite, sodium nitrite, and sodium thiosulfate. The other antidote that you might be familiar with or have heard about is hydroxocobalamin. It's marketed in the U.S. as Cyanokit, and it's a different sort of antidote altogether. Completely different mechanism of action than the cyanide antidote kit. Hydroxocobalamin is FDA approved for use in the United States for cyanide exposures attributed to smoke inhalation. And I'll explain to you some of the reasons why that is. But first, let's go back to the cyanide antidote kit. As I mentioned before, the cyanide antidote kit contains 2 different types of drugs. One is the nitrites, sodium nitrite or amyl nitrite, and the other is sodium thiosulfate. The way these drugs work, in a brief description, are the nitrites are administered to a patient to change the ability of the red blood cell and how it operates in terms of its ability to draw cyanide away from the cell. The red blood cell contains iron, and what the nitrites do is it changes the ability, or the valence is what it's called, of iron to attract the cyanide ion and bind it and excrete it from the body. Now, on the surface, that sounds good. And in the case of a just straightforward cyanide exposure, like perhaps an intentional ingestion of potassium cyanide or sodium cyanide, that's not a problem. In the setting of smoke, let your mind go back to the carbon monoxide example and why carbon monoxide disables the red blood cell. If you were to administer nitrites to a smoke inhalation patient, what happens is that change in the red blood cell further decreases the oxygen carrying capacity of the red blood cell. So now you've taken a person who is not transporting oxygen very well, and you've taken really what small ability there is to bring oxygen to the cells and pretty much disabled that by administering the sodium nitrite. So this is a key point, that in the setting of smoke, with a smoke inhalation patient, the nitrites can actually be contraindicated and not in the best interest of the patient if it's administered. The other drug in the kit, sodium thiosulfate, is indicated and has been used successfully on smoke inhalation patients across the country, across the world for that matter, for a number of years. It is safe to use. Its mechanism of action is it basically captures the cyanide ion. It goes from, and it changes from sodium thiosulfate to sodium thiocyanate, which is then excreted in the urine. So again, quick recap. The cyanide antidote kit for smoke inhalation patients is not a good choice because of the negative health effects that the nitrites could have on the red blood cell. Could cause increased hypotension or low blood pressure, which also exacerbates the medical condition of anybody exposed to smoke. So let's talk about the hydroxocobalamin. Hydroxocobalamin, when you look at it, is a red powdery substance which comes in a glass vial. It almost looks a little bit like red rock salt. It's a relatively benign drug with very few contraindications and a very high profile of safety when administered in the field. As paramedics, you know that you like to be able to give drugs that don't cause any harm if your assessment of the patient is not right. Hydroxocobalamin falls into that category. To draw a comparison for you, the drug called Narcan given to a heroin overdose, if the underlying cause is not a narcotic, then the Narcan doesn't have any other deleterious effects on the patient. It's safe to give. If you're wrong, you don't cause any more harm. Hydroxocobalamin falls into that same category. Now, a couple interesting things you should know about it is that once it's administered, as I mentioned to you before, it's a red powdery substance. Once that red powdery substance is reconstituted and given to the patient, their skin turns fairly dramatically red. So that's just something to be prepared for. But I'll tell you, when I think about those sorts of things, if I'm in a position where I need to get that antidote and it was somebody in my family, I'd much rather have the antidote administered, especially the hydroxocobalamin, because for me, I'd rather be red than dead. So I've given you just a very short introduction to a couple of the antidotes that are available in the U.S. And so I would encourage you to go to firesmoke.org or do some research on your own to learn more about each of those antidotes, what the indications are, what the contraindications are, and importantly, if one or the other is available in your healthcare system. So with that, I'd like to say thanks. I'd like to encourage you to continue to learn more about this topic. I think we can be only better off as an industry. I think our fire service culture can only be healthier down the road if we understand the hazards of fire smoke and we make the choice, because really that, at the end of the day, is what this is all about. Safety is your responsibility, really nobody else's. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, when nobody's looking over your shoulder and you're about to go into a smoky building, it's going to be your choice to put the mask on. So please, choose wisely.